Hey, my name is Beau. I'm a musician and music teacher, and in this video, I want to talk about why it's important to sequence the things you're learning properly so that you can get the most out of your practice sessions. So, years ago, when I started taking the idea of practicing more seriously and trying to research and read as much as I could about how to practice effectively, I eventually came across a guy named Siegfried Engelmann. And Engelmann was one of the progenitors of direct instruction, which is a whole movement of teaching and style of teaching. And Engelmann wrote a book called Theory of Instruction with a guy named Douglas Carnine. And this book is kind of insane to read. It's a very challenging read. It is something that does not rest on anything else. So a lot of the chapters have brand new content and it's just very dense. So if you're interested in reading it, just keep that in mind. But one of the concepts that Engelmann talks about with direct instruction and his style of teaching is that when you are learning sets of things, so musically this could be a bunch of different chords on the guitar. It could be a bunch of different chords in a key, like all the seventh chords in a key if you're like a jazz musician, or even all the ninth chords. Or if you want to learn how to do all the tritone substitutions in major. There's actually a ton of different tritone substitutions you could do, or a bunch of different kind of scales on the piano. There's really an endless amount of these things that Engelmann called sets. Now, what I've noticed when a lot of people practice, they are not very mindful about how they introduce information into themselves. And especially if you're a teacher, people can not be very mindful about what they're giving the student. And so I'll use a kind of a concrete example here just to anchor this conversation down. So let's say you are a jazz musician and you want to learn how to improvise well. And in order to do that, you are going to learn a bunch of scales. Now, maybe just to get started, you're going to learn a bunch of Dorian scales in all 12 keys. You're going to learn a bunch of melodic minor scales in all 12 keys. And let's say you're going to learn altered dominant scales. So you can play something cool over like a dominant chord. Now, we have three different kinds of scales here, and you probably want to play them all in all 12 keys. So now there's 36 pieces of content to learn. Now, what tends to happen when people kind of arrange their practice session or arrange their learning, they tend to do one of a few things. I mean, the first strategy is people kind of just throw the kitchen sink at it. They just practice everything in a random order that doesn't kind of make sense. That's the first strategy that happens a lot. The other strategy is people will tend to go through categories. So what they will do is they will work on their Dorian scales for a while and just focus on that for several weeks or who knows how long. And then once they feel like they have some kind of mastery over that, they kind of switch into working on melodic minor scales. And then they work on those for a while. And that is kind of more effective often than the first strategy, but it ends up taking so long to master it. It's not very satisfying, and quite frankly, it's just not that efficient. And so, what am I getting at here about sequencing? What's a better way to sequence things? So what Engelmann talks about is when you are adding members to a set, and this sounds insanely nerdy, and it is, but it works extremely well. You should be careful about how much information you add at a time. So a good example of this is when you sit down to work on a bunch of Dorian scales, and maybe you haven't mastered that content, what Engelmann would recommend is not working on all 12 at once. Don't go through all 12 keys at once. And the reason for this is that there can be a lot of interference in the knowledge. So let's say you start in D Dorian probably, and then maybe you move in, you move through the circle of fifths or whatever your strategy is. And a lot of people, especially beginners, they try to learn basically too much information at a time. And so it seems like they're getting ahead of the game because they're going to start all 12 keys right now and just kind of, bang their head against the wall. And they kind of struggle with that material for a practice session or a week or a couple weeks. And what I've noticed is that when people take that strategy where they take a lot of information out at a time, they tend to skim the surface of the information and not really master it. And so what do I mean in the context of this conversation? What does it mean to master something? You probably don't just want to be able to play the Dorian scale up and down if you are attempting to be a jazz musician and want to improvise and all that kind of stuff. You need to know how to play it on the instrument. You probably need to know how to play it with all different kind of interesting patterns. You want to recognize when other people are doing it. You want to actually be able to audiate it so you can hear this stuff in your mind with understanding away from your instrument. You want to be able to read the music notation if it's written on a staff. And so there's all these different skills that have to be interconnected together. And when we just kind of play through the scale in 12 keys, we're not spending any time working on that. What we're really doing is we're often just kind of playing through the scale in 12 keys and then hoping that magically that will give us the ability to improvise well, and it doesn't. And so what Engelmann recommends doing is slow down for a sec on the content. Don't worry about adding more members to the set. So now remember that the set is all the 12 Dorian scales, and each member is each individual scale and each individual key. And so slow down. Don't worry about doing all 12 in the first practice session. Take one of them. And even better, I think if you're a beginner, take a small part of that Dorian scale. So the first 3 notes. So at this point, it doesn't even sound recognizably Dorian. You know, the characteristic tones that would give away Dorian in comparison to other minor scales, we're not even working on. But can you actually take those 3 notes and do everything I just said? Can you play them on your instrument in different interesting patterns? Can you improvise with those? Could you put them in a song? If you were playing over a jazz standard, could you actually, if a standard came at you and it was actually in the key of D Dorian, would you be comfortable just on the fly playing that? Could you recognize if someone hit you with a bunch of D Dorian patterns with just those 3 notes, would you be able to tell what's going on just through audiation, just through your raw ear training power? Could you tell what's going on? Could you sing lines while you're just walking down the street without the piano or the guitar or whatever instrument you play, the sax or whatever? And so what we're doing is we're taking a smaller piece of content, but we're actually spending more time mastering it before we add more content on. And so traditionally, the way I've seen people learn scales is, you know, they learn 7 or 8 note scales or whatever it is, and they do the whole scale at once. But I found for beginners, it's even better to take smaller pieces, 3 note scales, then turn them into a 5 note scale, then a 7 note scale, and slow down in terms of playing through all 12 keys. It's a wonderful goal to play through all 12 keys, but if you're a beginner or an intermediate student, even if you're an advanced musician, when you're working on content that's brand new, it's way better to spend more time with a smaller piece of content that you put through the ringer, all kinds of variation, all kinds of different micro skills, like being able to sing it, being able to read it through notation, play it on an instrument. For me, I often have the goal of being able to play it on 2 instruments. So I want to be able to play it on the guitar and the piano if it's appropriate to play on both those instruments. And so we have a much higher bar of mastery. And then importantly, we want to apply it in the raw musical context that actually matters. So in this example, a jazz musician, they're probably going to want to actually compose tunes or improvise over standards. And can they take that piece of content and do it in the true context, the true end goal context? And so in the first couple of practice sessions, for a beginner working with D Dorian, in my mind, it should look a lot more like them exploring this small piece of content and playing around with it. And when you get the feel for this in a practice session, the practice session can actually be really fun because there's all these different things you can do, and you don't really just have to be like counting reps, like, well, I played each scale once and went through, you know, all 12 keys. You spend more time intimately getting to know something and really burning it into your audiation and burning it into your bones. And even the conceptual understanding, you should know, okay, these first 3 notes, it's the root, it's the second, it's the flat third. You should be training the theory at the same time. And I find when people just gloss over content, there's holes. You know, I heard someone say once, Swiss cheese learning. They have like the gist of it online, but there's all these big holes in the learning that surface later, and it creates big problems. And so the way Engelmann described this was he called it adding coordinate members to a set, and you should separate this by days, and preferentially even by multiple days. So you might do the first practice session with the D Dorian scale, just a tiny part of it. And then the next day, you may repeat exactly what you just did. You spend a couple days just working on the same thing. And then maybe the 3rd or 4th day, depending on the difficulty level, you add it in another key. Or if it's a 3-note scale, you make it into a 5-note scale. So what we're doing is we're incrementally ramping things up. And I totally understand this feels glacially slow. And if you're suffering from the the malady known as impatience, this feels crazy slow. But when we do this, I'm not saying you should only be working on D Dorian scales. What you should actually do is figure out a bunch of different sets that you want to work on, like major scales, dominant scales, ultra-dominant scales, octatonic, diminished scales, and do tiny, tiny things in each one of these every day. And this actually helps a lot with memory because they're so different than each other. Like the major scales will sound so different than the Dorian scales, which will sound so different than the diminished scales. But if you only do like micro versions of each, what it does is you're playing like oozes. And if you look at what's happening over the day or the week, it doesn't seem like a lot's happening. But if you fast forward 3 months, 1 year, 5 years, it's insane how much content you can memorize. And this is actually really strategic when you start talking about and thinking about how to retain musical information. The person that learns all 12 Dorian scales in the first practice session, they'll miss all those kind of interconnected skills that I talked about, but their memory, just the raw ability to memorize what they're doing, will really not be as good as someone who learns D Dorian over the first couple days, then maybe C Dorian, then G Dorian, then whatever Dorian. Someone who does a slow bleed, the concepts kind of sit in their mind over the long term much better. And so again, what you want to do is don't focus on one thing and try to play it in all 12 keys at first. Find a bunch of different things that you want to work on, major scales, minor scales, different techniques. I mean, I'm using the example of like jazz musician playing scales, but this could be like a classical pianist working on arpeggios. This could be, there's all kinds of things. This is not limited to, just playing jazz or just learning scales. Chord voicings, chord progressions, rhythms work like this too, playing in different meters. Don't try to master 2/4, play in 2/4, play in 3/4, play in 7/8, but work on one or two little things in each day and expand the set, make the set grow more over time. It ends up being a lot more enjoyable when you're practicing because practicing like this, let's take our beginning jazz guitar student. They don't need to be playing this D Dorian stuff very much, 3 or 4 minutes, 5 minutes, a couple times a day. Maybe in total they spend 10 minutes playing this little D Dorian thing that gets cemented in their musical mind forever. And that has just been a much more effective way that I found for me to practice new content, but for also, especially when I'm teaching students and teaching beginners. Now, a big caveat here is you have to gauge what your expertise level is. So if you are a professional jazz musician and let's say you have your basics online and you're really cooking and you're a great player, and then you try to play something new that you've never worked on, maybe like a Lydian sharp 2 scale, which is a beautiful sound by the way, you should check that out. Your knowledge of the Lydian scale is going to help you generalize to this new thing much more quickly than someone who's a true beginner. And so you probably could work on all 12 keys right away, or you probably could work on like 6 keys right away. And so this isn't like a blanket statement that no one's ever ready to just start something in all 12 keys, but you need to be more mindful about what the difficulty level is. And it's usually much better when something is completely alien to you to start with something very small and just dominate it and really get it in your bones and then take a step out. And then take a step out. Ends up being a much more efficient way to learn. It ends up being a lot more motivating because you get this constant feedback of mastery. And like I talked about in a couple other videos, that feeling of mastery that you get, it really does fuel your musical journey or adventure or learning, however you want to frame it, because it feels so good. You get some kind of emotional payoff. And at some point, this will turn into just being in full-blown flow states, and those can be very satisfying. But what I recommend is think about some of the stuff you want to work on. So if if there's scales you want to work on, rhythms, meters, harmonic progressions, could be techniques on the instrument. Think about how instead of working on one category of things and trying to do a lot of it, what you want to do is work on many categories of things and do just a little bit of each one of them and ooze them and grow them over time. It's a much more effective way to practice. So if you have any questions or comments, happy to get into a chat in the comment section below. I love talking about this stuff. My name is Beau. I offer online guitar and piano lessons. If you haven't checked out the first video on my channel called What is Audiation, you'd probably enjoy that if you don't know what audiation is. The third video on my channel called Why Do So Many Musicians Struggle with Music Theory really highlights the difference between audiation and music theory and how they support and reinforce each other. And if you're someone who's struggling to learn music theory effectively, that video can help clarify a few things. So go check those out. Thanks so much for tuning in.